What is a dungeon in an RPG? Well, it was made popular by that game that we all know, Dungeons and Blank, right? Dungeons was the first word in that game, and there's a reason for it. Because it is a self-contained adventure location, right? And that's perfect for a game like Dungeons and Dragons or many other RPGs. It's essentially just a contained adventure location. So we're going to talk more about the specifics of that in this video.
If you're looking for adventure, grab the modules each month to support the channel and play the campaign with your gaming group. You're sure to get hooked on adventure.
I wanted to thank everybody who made our Kickstarter a success, and if you missed out, you'll be able to pick up that later. Also, if you want our RPG materials, you can go to questgivers.com and pick up all our entire line of RPG materials, so check it out.
Now, dungeons are a narrative technique. So what that means is you actually use the location of a dungeon or the concept of a dungeon to actually structure the story. You know, we at Quest Givers are heavily story and narrative focused. That's the whole point of everything we do. So all our modules and everything use a philosophy of storytelling and of narrative techniques to put everything together. And at the center of this, for most role-playing games, is the concept of an enclosed location that you're able to run the players through. And the dungeon is really the prototype of this for everything else that happens in an RPG. So essentially, a dungeon creates a natural barrier between the story as it happens right now and the actual world of the story. So, you know, there's an entire world out there, but you don't want the players to be going absolutely everywhere. You want to kind of keep them corralled so that they're going to go off on a tangent. That's what a dungeon is. So basically, it's cutting you off from the rest of the world. You can get in and out of it, but you as the GM control this little microcosm of the universe that you've created that you run the players through.
So when you tell the players dungeon, right, it evokes a certain response from the players, and that is a place of adventure, right? Now, when they think of a dungeon, they think of traps, they think of danger, they think of monsters, treasure. It's all these things that are evoked when you mention the term dungeon. And it doesn't have to be a literal dungeon. It can be just a location that you go to that has these elements that the players are going to interact with and have an adventure at this place.
Now, a dungeon is a character in and of itself. It's as though it was an actual character in the game. You know, it has a personality, it has identity, it has narrative significance. All these things you need to consider when you're actually designing a dungeon. Think of it like an actual person. What is the personality? Is it angry? Is it sad? Is it happy? You know, how do you then portray that as part of what your dungeon actually is? So consider the fact that the dungeon is actually a character in the story. And then you can also use this, because a dungeon is just a prototype for all kinds of encased areas. You can then consider that for all your various locations in your game. What is the personality and character of that location? And think of it like an NPC, because that is what it is. It is a non-player character. The location is just as important in terms of providing information to the players. So it's not like you always have to have an NPC walk up and tell them what's happening. They can discover that through the location. And that's where the exploration part of the game becomes very interesting. And so you can use exploration the same way you would use social in the pillars of role-playing. Exploration can be just as exciting and just as interesting as the social component.
Now, you'll often find that low-level adventures can center around a dungeon, right? And there's a reason for that, because it's easier for a new DM/GM to run a dungeon than it is to, say, throw the players in the world and, okay, you decide what you're going to do, right? There's so many choices. It can be overwhelming to a new DM. But with a dungeon, you go left, right, you find this trap or not, you fight the monster, and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit limited in your choices because the nature of the dungeon, right? But that's easier on the new DMs and GMs who are getting into it. But don't think that because they're, you know, good for lower level or, you know, inexperienced DMs, that they're not also great for higher level, because you know, you can scale these up with your skill, right? You can run bigger dungeons. You can run dungeons with complex puzzles or traps and that kind of thing. So as you get more experience running them, you can make them more complex and more interesting, almost like you're leveling up with the game itself, right?
A critical component of a dungeon, especially for new GMs, is you're able to control the environment of the narrative. So you're actually able to control what's actually happening in the game a lot more because it's a very contained space. And this is important as you're learning to actually run the game and to run narrative events. So in Quest Givers, we're always having, it's an event-driven thing. All our modules are event-driven. Think about events that will happen in your dungeon as a new player, or even a veteran player. You may not have considered this. Design events that are going to happen, and then you place those events in the dungeon. Don't just have a space that's very static, so the person has to go to this room first, then has to go to this room, then has to go to this room. Detach the events from the rooms and detach the monsters from the rooms. So the monster can have a lair, but it doesn't mean the monster has to be in the lair. They have to confront the Dark Lord, but it doesn't have to be in the Dark Lord's chamber. It can be anywhere. The guy could be walking down the corridor and you encounter him in the kitchen. This is something that just makes the game more dynamic and more interesting, and you separate the events from the actual location. But this is where a dungeon is really great, because you have a limited number of locations and a limited number of events. So you're not going to have to wait for the players to discover things. It's easier for you to just place them where you need them in this really small number of locations within your dungeon.
Now, dungeons are not only self-contained kind of locations, but they're also self-contained ecosystems, right? What I like to do when I create a dungeon is think about, you know, the background of the dungeon, why it's there, what's in the dungeon, that kind of thing. You can just do a random, just roll random for everything in the dungeon. Oh, there's this trap here, this monster here, and it doesn't necessarily make sense that all this stuff is together. But if you put a story to the dungeon, you know, you get, not only do you get an interesting reason to go there, but it starts to fill in the blanks for what kind of ecosystem is existing in the dungeon. Why are the goblins here, and why are the other monsters here? Do they have a truce and they meet in the middle, or are they fighting each other? You know, how does the dungeon work? You know, how does you know, everything in the dungeon play out? And you want to, you know, it's fun for the players to discover that, as well as it is the traps and, you know, other interesting things that you explore in the dungeon. It's just as interesting to find out, okay, how does this dungeon work? What's going on with the ecosystem, the monsters, and why are they here? And you know, why don't they just kill each other? And this kind of thing. Is there a balance of power? Is there a war or whatever? So it's fun to have that kind of stuff in the dungeon. So think about not only having an interesting story and everything with your dungeon, but an interesting ecosystem as well.
So small dungeons can be for small or single session games, or just a couple of sessions. They're really great for that kind of thing. If you're going to run a one-shot in a new set of rules, or you're going to have a test game with new players, or you're testing out a new group, you can run a small dungeon. So that gives you, again, the opportunity to control the game a lot more. You can control what kind of mechanics are going to be happening in the game. So small dungeons are great for the sort of one-off games, or for just a small number of sessions. Like you're meeting for a weekend at a convention. Like Scotty and I are going to be at Mace in early November. So we'll have a few days, so we could run a couple of sessions if we wanted to. That's the kind of thing where you can do just small dungeons.
Now, we talked a little earlier about kind of leveling up your dungeons as your players, you know, get better and level up, because they can go longer and longer between rests or having to just retreat out of the dungeon. So, you know, as your characters acquire power and items and are able to, you know, go in, delve longer, right? You can create like mega dungeons. You can create larger dungeons, and you can have dungeons that, you know, connect throughout the campaign, or just a huge mega dungeon that the players go into. Now, low-level characters can do this too, but they're going to have to rest a lot more. So you have to take that into account. You're going to have spaces where the players can rest, especially if they're lower level. But yeah, you know, with a mega dungeon, it can be a really fun location, and sometimes an entire campaign can just go around a mega dungeon, right? It can be centered in a mega dungeon. You really don't deal with the outside world that much at all. It's mostly a mega dungeon. So yeah, dungeons have all kind of a scope. You know, you can just you know, a short adventure that they go into, kill a few goblins, rescue the blacksmith's daughter, and bring her back out, or you can just go in for months, you know, into a dungeon. So yeah, think about with dungeons, you know, how you're going to integrate them into your campaign, or even if they're going to be the campaign. How much do you like dungeons? How much do players like dungeons? I know my players love dungeons, and you know, I have a lot of them in there. I've never really done a whole campaign just centered around a dungeon, but it is an interesting thing that you can do, and it's something nice to think about, especially if your players just love dungeon delving.
If you enjoy these videos that we put out every Friday, don't forget you can support this channel by making purchases on our website, questgivers.com. We have a lot of different modules there. We have different tools that you can use in your RPG games, including how to create your own campaigns and your own sessions. And of course, our Kickstarter is on September 1st. Now, the pre-sales of our last Kickstarter will begin shortly, so you'll be able to check that out on our website as well. Thank you for joining us. Like button, and remember to share and click that bell if you're interested. Of course, there's a couple of videos here and a subscribe button that will help you get further into the Quest Givers universe. I just realized I didn't turn my lights on.